Sometimes it's not the anger that screams, it's the silence that suffocates. People who learn to suppress their impulses, to smile even when irritated, to respond with kindness while burning inside, live with a very specific kind of exhaustion, the kind that has no name but weighs on the body like lead. It's not about losing control, it's about never having allowed it. You feel it when something crosses your boundaries, but you swallow hard. You notice when someone hurts you, but you rationalize it with thoughts like it's not worth arguing or maybe I'm overreacting. The result is not peace. It's a silent buildup that ferments in the chest and turns your presence into an emotional minefield. Little things irritate you more than they should. Sounds, delays, gestures, careless words. Everything becomes a trigger for an impatience even you don't understand. And that happens because what you repress doesn't vanish. It just changes form. The problem with contained anger is that it doesn't dissolve, it recalculates. If you don't let it out the front door, it sneaks in through the back window. It puts on disguises. Sometimes it becomes constant irony, a sarcasm that sounds funny but wounds. Other times it hides under indifference, an emotional detachment that protects you from pain, but also prevents connection. Some channel their rage into hyperproductivity, as if keeping the mind busy were the only way to avoid facing their own fury, and others internalize it so deeply that the body starts to respond. Insomnia, muscle tension, gastritis, unexplained pain. The body speaks, and almost always when we don't allow ourselves to feel something, it ends up feeling it for us. Many believe only those who scream are angry, but the world is full of silent, smiling, gentle people who are deeply furious. The difference is that these people were taught that feeling anger is wrong, ugly, inappropriate, that only the weak lose control, that only the ill-mannered slam doors, and so they developed such intense emotional control that they stopped recognizing their own limits. They started enduring everything. And what begins as emotional maturity over time turns into self-abandonment. You start to tolerate what hurts, to justify those who hurt you, to remain silent even when the pain overflows. This script isn't about learning to explode, it's about recognizing that anger is also a compass, that feeling discomfort is a sign of life, that there is dignity in admitting, "This hurt me," that you don't need to become aggressive to be truthful, but constant repression of this emotion may be sabotaging your relationships, your mental health, and your very identity, because the more you repress, the more you disconnect from yourself. And the harder it becomes to know what you really feel, or even who you are, beyond the effort of pleasing everyone. No one is born afraid of feeling anger. No one comes into the world believing that expressing pain or indignation is wrong. That fear comes later, from a disapproving look, from a voice yelling, "Stop crying," from a door that slams shut when all you did was try to say something wasn't right. So often the seed of fear around anger is planted in childhood, when the adults who should have welcomed your emotions simply didn't know how to handle their own. You got upset, cried, threw a tantrum, and what you received in return was punishment, silence, or accusations that you were being dramatic, ungrateful, or disrespectful. Little by little, you learned that showing anger meant losing love, and no one wants to lose love when they still depend on it to survive. Children who grow up in homes where anger is forbidden learn to mask their most genuine impulses. They learn to adapt to the moods of adults, to decode facial expressions, to measure the tone of their voice so they won't bother anyone. They become specialists in reshaping themselves, in yielding, in anticipating what others want to hear. And the more emotional intelligence they develop to avoid being a burden, the more they lose the right to be themselves. They learn to stay calm even when they're falling apart, to smile so as not to make a tense environment worse. And this premature maturity, often praised as wisdom, is in truth an armor built in haste to survive an emotionally unstable space. The real pain isn't just in the moments when you felt anger and were silenced. It lies, more painfully, in the moments when you didn't even realize you were angry. Because the emotional conditioning was so intense that your body felt it before your mind could name it. You remember scenes where someone treated you with contempt, where your pain was dismissed, where words hit you like knives, but you only cried later, alone. And even then you blamed yourself for feeling too much, because that child grew up believing that being loved meant not causing trouble, not being a burden, not exploding. And in that script, anger was always the problem. But the truth is that childhood anger, the real kind, the one that arises when something just and fair is violated, was never the problem. The real problem was having learned there was no safe place to feel, that any expression of frustration could lead to abandonment, criticism, or humiliation. That affection was conditional on obedience, that love came with the demand for sweetness, and that, to remain accepted, it was safer to suffocate than to confront. You grew up afraid of losing people, and for that you accepted losing parts of yourself. When that child becomes an adult, they still try to be good, understanding, resilient. They even show empathy to others, but won't allow themselves to feel anger, not even toward those who cause deep harm. They still fear that by saying, "This hurt me," the other person will leave. They still equate conflict with loss. And so, the cycle of self-erasure continues. Because no one taught them that it's possible to feel anger and still be worthy of love. That it's possible to disagree without breaking the bond. That anger, when acknowledged, heard, and respected, can be a bridge, not a rupture. There's a kind of silence that isn't peace, it's punishment. A cold wall built around a rage that was never allowed to be felt with dignity. People who've learned not to react, who internalize the belief that expressing anger is weakness or poor manners, often develop a subtle yet devastating defense. They pull away, physically, emotionally, energetically. They're there, but not really. They respond, but don't connect. They listen, but don't offer presence. And all of it stems from a frustration that, because it's never voiced, morphs into bitterness. A kind of cold anger, lacquered in self-control, yet heavy with resentment. This bitter silence doesn't arrive with shouting. It arrives with widening distance, with conversations that fade, with touches that no longer carry touch. It's the indifferent whatever, the it's nothing that holds everything inside. The person doesn't argue, but they don't forget either. They don't accuse, but they withdraw. They believe they're being mature by not reacting, but inside, the body screams, the throat tightens, the tension builds. Because what they're doing isn't forgiveness. It's emotional freezing, a kind of self-abandonment disguised as harmony. But what kind of harmony costs you your truth? Often, the choice to stay silent is a form of survival. You've tried to speak before and weren't heard. You were labeled dramatic, too much, difficult. You've lost affection for daring to confront. And in a reflex of self-protection, you learned to stay quiet. But no one told you that silence also hurts. It doesn't solve. It festers. It becomes small internal explosions that show up between the lines of your behavior, in constant irritation toward people who don't deserve it, in the emotional exhaustion that never fades, in the unresolved sense of injustice that lingers. This silent anger begins to seep into everything. Your closest relationships, your workplace, the way you speak to yourself. It corrodes your ability to trust, to give, to truly open up. Because you've come to believe that feeling is dangerous, that speaking pushes people away, that vulnerability gives the other person ammunition. So you hide behind a polished surface of calm, maturity, self-control, but deep down, it still hurts. And this silence that seems to protect you isolates you. It leaves you alone inside yourself. It takes courage to break that cycle, to say, maybe with a trembling voice, that you are angry, that something hurt, that you expected more. It's not about blaming the other person, but about recovering yourself, about reclaiming your humanity through words, because as long as you keep swallowing anger, it will continue to poison your relationships in invisible ways. Only when you learn to speak, even if you're afraid, can others truly hear you. And more importantly, only then will you finally be able to hear yourself. There's a kind of anger that doesn't come from a wounded ego or inflated pride. It comes from a much deeper place, the desperate attempt to protect something that was violated, ignored, or disrespected, and that something is always precious. In this context, anger isn't a loss of control. It's an alarm. It's the emotional cry of someone whose soul has been pierced by something that threatened their sense of worth, their dignity, their inner space. It's the body saying, not this, not here, not with me. And as much as we've been trained to view anger as ugly, wrong, or destructive, it carries a vital function, to protect what defines us. Because we only feel anger toward what matters. We only react when something of ours is touched without care. Behind the anger that explodes, there's almost always a poorly translated request for care. And behind the anger that gets suppressed, there's a wound of invalidation. The person feels it, but doesn't allow themselves to show it. Because they fear being judged. Because they've learned that showing irritation means losing control. But what's truly there is a sensitive core. Anger is the wall that rises around something fragile that's being threatened. Sometimes it's the need to be respected. Sometimes it's the desire to be heard. Sometimes it's the pain of not being seen. When you feel invaded, ignored, manipulated, or betrayed, it's natural for anger to arise. The problem isn't feeling it. The problem is not understanding where it comes from and not knowing what to do with it afterward. Society taught us to praise love, forgiveness, compassion, but never anger. Anger is seen as the emotion of chaos, of impulse, of aggression. But no one ever told you that anger can also be integrity, that saying enough can be just as healing as asking for forgiveness, that raising your voice, when done with awareness, can be an act of affirmation, not violence, that taking a stand against injustice doesn't make you difficult, it makes you alive. Anger is only destructive when it's disorganized, unspoken, unheard. When you don't understand it, it takes forms you can't control. But when you realize you're angry because something valuable was hurt, you begin to reclaim your right to defend yourself without losing your humanity. Many people who suppress anger pride themselves on being understanding, on not holding grudges, on never fighting with anyone. But deep down, that constant calm comes at a high cost, because the absence of external conflict often hides a brutal internal battle, the struggle between the need to please and the need to be authentic. And by suppressing anger, that person also suppresses their vital force. They start accepting crumbs, tolerating disguised abuse, smiling while bleeding, because they've lost touch with their protective boundary. Healthy anger is the limit that keeps us whole. It's the no that strengthens our yes. It's the warning that prevents pain from becoming routine. Allowing yourself to feel anger is an act of self-love. It's the recognition that you have worth, that something within you is worth protecting, and that this something no longer needs to hide behind the fear of disappointing others. Anger is not your enemy. It's a messenger. And when you learn to listen to it, without repression, without explosion, it stops being a threat and becomes a tool for rebuilding, reconnecting, and reclaiming yourself. What you repress, your body expresses. The anger you learned to silence didn't disappear. It simply changed language. And now it speaks through the tension in your jaw, the back pain that never goes away, the insomnia that visits you even when everything seems fine. It speaks through the exhaustion without cause, the migraines, the rising blood pressure, the burning gastritis, the involuntary spasms, the tightness in your chest that has no diagnosis. Modern medicine already knows. Undigested emotions inflame the body, and repressed anger is one of the most corrosive. When there's no symbolic space for it to be released through words, it exits through the body, quietly, yet devastatingly. There are studies linking chronic emotional suppression to autoimmune disorders, hormonal dysregulation, cardiovascular problems, and even an increased risk of cancer. This is not an exaggeration. The human body was designed to feel, to process, and to discharge emotions. If you live in a constant state of emotional containment, your physiology becomes imbalanced. The sympathetic nervous system, responsible for the fight or flight response, stays activated, releasing cortisol and adrenaline in excess. Tension becomes a permanent state, and that ongoing vigilance, that exhausting effort to appear calm when everything inside is screaming, comes at a steep cost. Mental health and physical health are not separate. They are two sides of the same unspoken pain. And perhaps that's why even with a healthy diet, regular exercise, and a balanced routine, you still feel depleted. Because what's making you sick isn't just what you do, it's what you hold back. You can go to the gym, but if you're swallowing everything you feel, your body remains locked. You can meditate, but if you're living in environments where you can't express yourself, your mind remains restless. You can take medication, but if you don't acknowledge that you're angry, the symptom will return elsewhere. It's not healing if it ignores the cause, and the cause sometimes is an old, forgotten anger, frozen inside you, waiting to be heard. What's most cruel is that many people only realize the depth of what they've felt when their body begins to fail, when the fatigue becomes chronic, when the pain repeats itself, when the doctor says, "There's nothing physically wrong here." And then comes the suspicion, is my body saying something my mind refused to hear? Yes, it is speaking. It's telling you that you're not a machine built to endure, that your anger isn't a flaw. It's a vital sign that the care you give to others shouldn't come at the cost of your integrity, that constant silence makes you sick, that living too restrained is a slow form of dying. Healing the body, in this case, requires more than treatments. It requires listening, emotional listening. Listening to what you felt but swallowed, to what pierced you but was never named, to what hurt you and was rationalized away. Beginning to express anger safely, through therapy, writing, or conscious speech, is part of the healing process. The body needs to release what the soul couldn't carry alone. And every time you allow yourself to feel honestly, without censorship, without shame, you lighten a bit of the inflammatory burden weighing on you. Because sometimes what heals physical pain isn't a pill, it's a truth spoken out loud. Love doesn't die overnight, it wears down. And often, that erosion comes from unspoken anger, unvalidated pain, from hurt that accumulates silently until it turns into resentment. Resentment is a form of frozen anger. It doesn't shout, it doesn't confront, but it also doesn't forgive. It settles in the eyes that no longer shine, in the voice that lost its sweetness, in the touch that became an empty habit. It's a kind of mourning for something that's still alive but has already lost its soul. Relationships that could be deep, honest, and healing slowly become poisoned by small frustrations that were never voiced. And it happens because someone, at some point, was afraid to say, "This hurt me." The cruelest part is that resentment doesn't show up as obvious blame toward the other person. It manifests as general irritation, growing disinterest, silent judgment. It's a form of distancing that seems logical. You think you're just tired, impatient, overwhelmed. But underneath that, there's unprocessed anger that's turned into emotional frost. When you love someone but never had the space to say something hurt you, that love begins to deteriorate, and you start punishing the other person in subtle ways, withholding affection, avoiding closeness, denying presence. The relationship becomes a testing ground. You test whether they'll notice that you're not okay, whether they'll sense something has changed, but you don't say anything, because you're still afraid that speaking might break the bond. What no one taught you is that every deep relationship demands conflict, that loving isn't the absence of friction, it's the courage to move through it. That saying, "I'm angry with you," can actually be an investment in the connection, not a threat to it. That anger, when spoken with honesty and care, can create space for healing. But if swallowed, it poisons, and it turns love into burden. The lightness disappears, spontaneity fades. All that remains is the exhausting effort to maintain something that still looks beautiful on the outside, but inside is already broken. Resentment is the result of a failed attempt to protect the relationship by avoiding pain. But ironically, it's resentment that ends up destroying what you were trying to preserve. When you repress your anger to keep someone close, you betray yourself, and that self-betrayal eats away at intimacy, because no one can love fully while feeling wronged, overlooked, or constantly swallowing their truth in the name of peace. That kind of peace, when bought with silence, costs too much. And the bill always comes due, sometimes as distance, sometimes as delayed explosions, sometimes as total emotional withdrawal. If you feel that something in your love is turning bitter, it might not be the end of love. It might be accumulated pain. Legitimate anger you never had the courage to name. It's not too late. What destroys a relationship isn't anger itself, it's the denial of it. What sours the connection isn't conflict, it's silence steeped in resentment. Speaking with care can save, listening with truth can rebuild, and allowing yourself to feel what you feel without guilt is the first step to loving with real presence. Anger doesn't always go outward. Often it turns inward, and when it turns inward, it becomes self-sabotage. You don't yell at anyone, but you quietly sabotage yourself. You don't confront the person who hurt you, but you punish yourself without even realizing it. You cancel important plans, delay your dreams, procrastinate on crucial decisions. You sabotage opportunities. You choose the hardest path, the loneliest one, the one that's never quite enough. And the worst part, you think it's a lack of willpower. You think it's laziness, but deep down it's the anger that was never allowed to be felt in a legitimate way. The anger that should have been directed at the one who hurt you, but got redirected toward yourself, because it felt safer to attack yourself than risk losing someone's love. This kind of internalized anger is silent and disguised. It hides in chronic procrastination, in paralyzing perfectionism, in patterns of choosing relationships where you constantly have to shrink yourself to be accepted. Repressed anger creeps into self-deprecating thoughts. I never do anything right. Nobody can stand me. I don't deserve anything good anyway. And when those thoughts become repetitive, you start believing them. And then you begin to live in a way that aligns with that belief. You sabotage yourself in interviews. You stay quiet during arguments where you should have spoken up. You settle for less than you need. Because deep down, you believe you deserve that lack. That you're not allowed to want more. That you must pay the price for having bad feelings. The cycle is cruel. The more you swallow your anger, the more it eats you from within. And because you don't recognize it as anger, since it's been denied to you your whole life, it shows up as melancholy, apathy, paralysis. It's the weight of not knowing why you feel stuck, why you can't move forward, why even with talent, love around you, and opportunities at hand, something inside keeps making it all fall apart. The answer often lies in emotions you weren't allowed to feel, in injustices you silenced, in boundaries that were crossed, and you let it happen. And in the end, you were the one who paid the price. Reversing this process takes courage, the courage to say, I am angry. Not because you're ungrateful, spoiled, or dramatic, but because you were hurt. And feeling anger over injustice is a basic emotional right. It's psychological health. But since that right was denied to you early on, you transformed it into guilt. And out of guilt, you punished yourself. You broke promises to yourself. You abandoned your dreams. You accepted the bare minimum. And now you carry a life that doesn't reflect who you truly are, only who you learned to be to survive. Healing self-sabotage begins with recognizing the anger you never dared to feel. It begins by naming what hurt you, by validating the pain that was ignored, by embracing the part of you that still waits in silence for someone to say, you were right to be angry. And if no one ever said it, maybe it's time you said it to yourself, because only when anger stops being a punishment and becomes a language can it stop attacking you from within and begin protecting you from the outside. One of the greatest emotional confusions we were taught is believing that feeling anger is the same as being aggressive, that expressing frustration, indignation, or discomfort is equivalent to hurting, yelling, or destroying. And because of that confusion, many people grew up repressing a basic right, the right to feel. When you associate anger with violence, you begin to avoid it at all costs. You start living in an artificial state of calm, even when everything inside you is imploding. But the truth is, anger isn't the problem. The problem is what you do with it, or what you were prevented from doing. Aggressiveness is an action that can harm. Anger is an emotion that can protect. And learning to separate the two is one of the greatest acts of emotional maturity you can offer yourself. You have the right to feel angry. You have the right to be bothered by injustice, to reject what was invasive, to react when your boundaries are crossed. Anger is your emotional system saying, this isn't right. It's your body trying to preserve your integrity. And when you ignore that message, you're not being mature. You're betraying yourself. You're silencing your inner compass. You're training yourself to tolerate the intolerable. And that over time becomes illness, becomes exhaustion, becomes self-abandonment. Many people who pride themselves on never getting angry are actually numbed. It's not peace, it's erasure. Because true peace doesn't come from the absence of conflict. It comes from the ability to face conflict with awareness. It comes from the maturity to feel anger, to recognize it, to hold it, and then to decide what to do with it. It comes from the courage to say, I didn't like that. This hurt me. I need this to change, without humiliating anyone, without exploding, without harming. That's assertiveness. That's emotional presence. That's anger transformed into dignity. And the most beautiful part is that when you allow yourself to feel anger with clarity, it no longer controls you. Because what is repressed dominates. What is acknowledged integrates. People who don't recognize their anger either explode at the worst moments, or stay silent until they fall ill, or unconsciously project their pain onto others. But those who look within and say, yes, I'm angry, yes, that hurt me, yes, I need to stand up for myself, are the ones who can act without harming. They can preserve relationships without violating themselves. They can build connections where there is room to feel, not just to please. Expressing anger is not a character flaw. It's a plea for reconnection. It's a sign that something important has been touched. And when you learn to do it with clarity and responsibility, you stop being a prisoner of guilt, and you begin finally to live as someone who knows who they are. Someone who feels, who speaks, who protects themselves, and who, because of that, is capable of loving with greater truth. There's a kind of pain few people ever admit, the pain of feeling angry at someone you love. Because we've been taught that love and anger are opposites, we start believing that simply feeling anger makes us bad people. You catch yourself being impatient with your partner, resentful toward your mother, irritated with your child, hurt by your best friend. But instead of accepting anger as a legitimate part of emotional connection, you blame yourself. You accuse yourself. You go silent. And it's in that heavy silence that relationships begin to twist. Because you're still physically present, but emotionally conflicted, not just with the other person, but with yourself. The truth is, there's no real love without conflict. Every close bond will, at some point, touch a tender spot. It will frustrate you, irritate you, disappoint you. That doesn't mean the love is gone. It only means you're both human, that you meet not in perfection, but in the friction of two stories trying to walk together. Feeling anger towards someone you love isn't a moral failure. It's inevitable. What damages the relationship isn't the anger itself, but the guilt that prevents it from being expressed with respect. When you start swallowing everything for fear of being unfair, ungrateful, or disloyal, you begin to drift. You grow quiet, and intimacy becomes a performance. The most mature kind of love isn't the one that never clashes. It's the one that can bear hearing what the other feels, even when it hurts. It's the kind of love that leaves room to say, I love you, but that hurt me. I care about you, but I'm angry. I want to stay close, but this needs to change. That kind of communication demands maturity. It requires emotional courage. And most of all, it asks you to free yourself from the belief that expressing anger means destroying the bond. Because in truth, it's the suppressed anger that corrodes the foundation of a relationship, like a hidden leak that seems small, but eventually brings the whole structure down. Think about the times you've been hurt by someone you love. You probably tried to rationalize it. He didn't mean it. She was just stressed. It's just how he is. And maybe all of that is true, but it still hurt, and that pain doesn't vanish just because you try to understand it logically. It only morphs into resentment, coldness, emotional fatigue. What that pain needed was to be heard, to have a voice, to be named. Because when you name your anger with love, it becomes organized. It doesn't destroy. It doesn't seek revenge. It simply says, I exist. And someone who truly loves you must learn how to hear that existence. Don't blame yourself for feeling angry. Blaming yourself for a legitimate emotion is what makes you ill. Allow yourself to feel it, to recognize it, to turn it into careful words, because every lasting love must travel through that delicate space where pain needs to be heard, not denied, where anger can be held, not repressed, where you can be whole, with both light and shadow, and still be loved. There's a kind of distance that doesn't begin with a fight or a betrayal. It starts in the invisible. It starts when you feel anger and swallow it, when you feel hurt and stay silent, when something bothers you, but you choose to let it go in the name of peace. But that peace comes at a cost, and the cost is the connection itself, because every time you repress a legitimate emotion, it doesn't disappear. It accumulates, and it slowly builds a distance you can't quite explain. You still love, but no longer feel the same desire to be close. You still care, but begin to avoid conversations. The other person's presence, once a safe haven, now brings discomfort. And you don't know why, but your body knows, your soul knows. And the silence that once felt like protection becomes a chasm. This kind of distance isn't always intentional. Often it's a defense. You drift not because you stopped loving, but because it became too heavy to stay close without being real. And since you never learned to say, this hurts me, you start protecting your heart in the only way you know how, by slowly pulling away, keeping busy, losing patience over small things, getting irritated by everything and nothing. Until one day the other person notices you're not the same. The light in your eyes is gone. The touch has turned mechanical. The conversations have dried up. But when they ask what's wrong, you don't know how to answer, because you haven't had the courage to listen to your own anger. This is how unexplained distances are born, the kind of ruptures no one can name, but everyone can feel. Relationships that grow lukewarm, distant, functional, where there's still interaction, but no longer connection. And the most painful part is that deep down it could have been different. All it needed was space to feel. One honest conversation, one moment of vulnerability where anger wasn't seen as a threat, but as a call for repair, as the silent cry of someone who still wants to stay, but needs to be truly heard. Many people only realize how angry they were once they're already gone, when they no longer know how to open up. When the other has become an emotional stranger, and then comes the regret, the feeling of I should have said something, I should have been honest, I should have shown what I felt before walking away on the inside. But it's already too late. The anger that wasn't expressed with love has turned into disinterest, and the love that never had space to grow in truth has become the past. That's why learning to express anger is an act of protection toward the relationships you value. It's saying, I care so much about this bond that I'd rather speak than stay silent. It's understanding that walking away may feel safer, but it doesn't heal. It only postpones the inevitable. Feeling anger isn't the problem. The problem is letting it erode what you most wanted to preserve. When you allow yourself to express before withdrawing, you give both the other person and yourself the chance to rebuild, to repair, to reconnect. There are pains that hurt twice. The first is when they happen. The second is when no one believes them. And it's in that second blow that many people learn to ignore their own anger. You went through situations where you were clearly disrespected, humiliated, dismissed, belittled. But when you tried to speak up, you were told you were overreacting, that you were too sensitive, that it wasn't like that. And little by little, you disconnected from your own sense of justice, from your emotional compass. Because if no one validated what you felt, then it felt safer not to feel. Better to doubt yourself than to risk more rejection. That repeated invalidation creates a kind of emotional anesthesia. You keep going through painful experiences, but your body has learned to respond with numbness. Your face doesn't change, your voice stays steady, but inside something clenches. You can tell something wasn't right, but you've lost the spontaneity to feel indignation. Your anger was dismissed so many times it became background noise. You got used to discomfort, and now you live as someone who endures everything: the subtle criticism, the cancelled invitations, the sideways glances, the jokes that cut deep. Everything enters and stays, because you never learned how to expel what hurts, only how to swallow it. And the worst part is that over time, you begin to blame yourself for feeling anything at all. When anger arises, you judge it. When hurt comes, you rationalize it. When indignation stirs, you silence it. And so what was once a legitimate response to injustice becomes a source of shame. You become your own censor, your own executioner, and with every real emotion you repress, you reinforce the belief that you don't have the right to feel, that the problem is you, that it's better to stay quiet than to be a burden. But what if your anger was right all along? What if that pain no one took seriously was actually a sign that something sacred inside you was being violated? What if your body always knew what your mind was taught to deny? Validating your own anger isn't becoming a prisoner to it. It's reclaiming your integrity. It's saying, I'm not crazy, fragile, or overreacting. I was hurt, and that pain has the right to exist, to be named, to be listened to with compassion. Legitimate anger doesn't need to be hidden. It needs a safe space to be understood. The path to healing begins when you stop asking for permission to feel, when you stop waiting for others to validate what you already know, that it hurt, that it wasn't fair, that you deserved more. Legitimate anger is the kind that arises when something sacred in you has been violated, and no one but you can know how deeply it cut. You no longer need to convince yourself that everything's fine. It's not, and it's okay not to be okay. The truth is, your anger was always a sign of life. You were just taught not to listen. Maybe now it's time to hear it. Not all the anger you feel was born in you. Some pain is inherited. Entire generations were never allowed to cry, to complain, to demand. Families where silence was the rule, where pride outweighed affection, where feeling was a sign of weakness. And in that emotionally stifled environment, a lot of anger was stored, locked away, redirected. It didn't disappear, it was passed down. Like an invisible code, it travels through time and arrives in you in the form of impulses you don't understand, disproportionate reactions, tensions with no clear explanation, and then you blame yourself for feeling too much. But maybe what you're carrying was never yours to begin with. Growing up in an emotionally dysfunctional environment is a training in normalizing what is toxic. You saw your parents suppressing themselves or exploding, or going silent for days. You witnessed passive-aggressive conflicts, buried resentments, apologies that were never spoken, and even when there were no screams, there were screaming silences. Anger was always present, in the tension in the air, in the absence of tenderness, in hostility disguised as indifference. And you, as a child, absorbed all of this as the way the world worked. You learned to read faces, to protect yourself emotionally, to adapt in order not to displease. But now, as an adult, those adaptations became patterns, and the unresolved anger of those who came before continues to echo through you, often without your awareness. You may have inherited the habit of staying silent, of lashing out at the people you love, of getting irritated by small things, of punishing yourself without reason, of distrusting peace, of not knowing how to handle affection without first putting up your guard. These reactions may seem like they're yours, but they're echoes, emotional responses that belong to a larger story, a family system where pain was never allowed a voice, where feeling was dangerous, where hardening was the safest choice. And now, even if you want to live differently, you find yourself repeating the same patterns and not knowing why. It takes courage to break this cycle, to look within and ask, is this anger mine or was it taught to me? Where did this fear of feeling come from? Is this reaction proportional or is it a repetition? Only when you begin to name what you carry can you decide what continues and what needs to end. Honoring your story doesn't mean repeating it. It means healing it. It means interrupting the flow of silent pain. It means saying, with me, this ends. You don't have to carry the emotional weight of an entire lineage. You don't have to be the vessel for other people's frustrations. You don't have to keep repeating patterns that hurt you just because that's how you learn to survive. Feeling anger is legitimate, but it needs to be yours, not inherited, not borrowed, not projected. And the only way to tell the difference is by listening to yourself with honesty, by looking at your pain with compassion, not judgment. Because maybe in recognizing that you were also marked by wounds you never asked for, you can finally let go of what never should have been yours to hold. There is a moment that can change everything, and it doesn't require shouting or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes everything begins with a simple phrase, spoken in the trembling voice of someone who was never taught how to speak. This hurt me. Within that sentence lives the courage of someone who spent a lifetime staying silent. It holds the recovery of a feeling that was ignored, distorted, swallowed. It's in that instant that you stop trying to appear strong, understanding, immune, and begin, finally, to be honest. Because anger, when it finds words, stops being an invisible weight that distances you from the world and becomes language, communication, bridges. And it's in this crossing between silence and speech that you begin to set yourself free. Saying something hurt you is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of awareness. It means you are present enough within yourself to recognize where something crossed your boundaries. It means you trust yourself enough to give voice to your pain without needing long justifications or apologies, because pain that is felt is legitimate, even if others don't understand it. And naming it is not an accusation, it's self-responsibility. It's standing in the world as a whole person, even if it means risking not being embraced, because the worst prison isn't someone else's rejection, it's the self-betrayal of feeling and staying silent. This kind of liberation isn't loud, it's subtle, but transformative. It happens in the moment you stop swallowing frustration, stop accepting the unacceptable, stop smiling when what you really needed was to cry. It's when you understand that emotional maturity is not about enduring everything, but about choosing what's worth holding on to. That inner peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict, but from walking through it with honesty. That self-love is not built only through self-care, but through self-assertion. Saying, "This hurt me," is a way of holding your existence with dignity. It's giving yourself the right to exist with emotion, to no longer need to shapeshift in order to fit in. And the magic begins when you realize the world doesn't fall apart when you speak your truth. Yes, some people might be uncomfortable, Some might pull away, but others, the right ones, will come closer, because only those who know your truth can truly connect with you. Those who hear your pain without trying to shrink it. Those who understand that your anger is not an attack, but a request for care. And in that new space, something is born that goes beyond relief, a sense of belonging. Belonging not for being agreeable, calm or easy to love, but for being authentic. You no longer have to live trapped between the fear of hurting and the fear of being hurt. There is a path in between, the path of speaking with presence, of feeling with awareness, of expressing with love. And it all begins with that one phrase you never allowed yourself to say, "This hurt me." Spoken with an open heart, it can be the key that unlocks the silence, and with it, sets free the most alive part of you. Few things are as revolutionary as learning to say no without feeling cruel. Few acts of self-love are as profound as setting a boundary and holding it firmly, even when the other person doesn't understand. And this is what well-placed anger teaches, that protecting yourself is not selfishness, it's care. That walking away from environments that hurt is not coldness, it's integrity. That standing your ground when something wounds you is not drama, it's emotional survival. When anger gains a lucid voice, it doesn't wound, it defines. It draws the line between what is acceptable and what is not. It says, "This is where my tolerance ends." And that boundary doesn't drive love away, it purifies it. What you might be calling rudeness may actually be your instinct for self-protection rising back to the surface. After years of saying yes when you wanted to say no, smiling when you wanted to disappear, swallowing offenses disguised as jokes, there comes a point when your body simply can't take it anymore. Patience runs dry, understanding wears out, and a new movement begins to emerge. The refusal to keep accepting what you already know is poisoning you. That's when anger finds its rightful place, not as an attack, but as a foundation, not as a rupture, but as a structure of respect. Because loving yourself takes more than kindness, it takes courage. Well-placed anger is the opposite of losing control. It doesn't arrive shouting, it arrives firm, calm, direct. It says what needs to be said, it faces the consequences, it doesn't beg to be understood, it stands rooted in truth. And that's why it's so unsettling, because most people are used to appeasement, to masks, to silence. When someone says, "I don't like this, I don't accept that tone," it doesn't feel good to be here. Without raising their voice, but without lowering their eyes, something shifts in the room. Respect appears, and often so do reactions, distance, discomfort, criticism. But you are no longer here to please everyone. You are here to be whole. This kind of presence is only possible when you stop seeing anger as something to be suppressed and begin to see it as a compass. When you understand that feeling, indignation is often the first step toward freeing yourself from the dynamics that trap you. That anger shows you where you've abandoned yourself, where you've gotten lost trying to please, where you've shrunk yourself to fit in, and that every time you honor this feeling, you are telling yourself, "I matter. My pain matters. My peace comes first." That's the kind of love that truly heals, the one that begins with you. And no, it won't be easy at first. You'll feel guilty. You'll doubt yourself. You'll be tempted to go back, because a life shaped around self-erasure finds freedom strange when it finally arrives. But over time, you'll see that the relationships that can withstand your truth are the only ones worth keeping, that the spaces that welcome your voice are the ones that truly belong to you, and that anger, far from being a flaw, was the emotion that saved you from disappearing inside yourself. Anger doesn't have to be a wall between you and someone else. It can be a bridge. It can be the most honest path to rebuild what was cracked by silence, by accumulation, by the fear of seeming weak. Learning to express anger without hurting is one of the greatest challenges of emotional maturity, and at the same time one of the most healing experiences you can have. Because it's not about suppressing anger or exploding, it's about transforming it into clear, grounded, connected language. About saying what needs to be said without aggression, but also without hiding. About no longer imploding on the inside to avoid someone else's reaction, and instead, learning to hold your truth with presence. That's where anger becomes a tool, no longer an uncontrolled emotion that sweeps you away, nor a shadow you try to conceal, but a guide that reveals what matters, what hurts, what needs repair. From this place of clarity, you can say, I'm hurt. That crossed a boundary of mine. I need to talk about this so we can move forward together. When anger comes with awareness and care, it doesn't create distance, it brings closeness. It pulls you out of fantasy, of games, of subtle manipulation, and leads straight to what's real. Because only on the surface of truth can connection truly breathe. And it's not about saying everything you feel however you want. It's about caring for how you say it. It's about putting warmth into hard words, about choosing the right time, about looking someone in the eye and making room for listening, but without staying silent, because silence, when too prolonged, poisons. And those who love for real don't just want coexistence, they want presence. They want to feel they're with someone who feels, who speaks, who takes a stand, who says this hurt me instead of disappearing, who says I'm angry, but I want to work through it, instead of punishing with coldness. Anger is not the end of love. Many times it's the beginning of real love, because to love is not to never feel frustrated. It's having the courage to continue even after the conflict, to be able to fail and forgive, to be able to speak and be heard. And that only happens when all emotions have space, when you stop being trapped by the idea that you must always be kind, calm, and understanding, and instead become truthful. When you allow yourself to feel and trust that the other person can meet you there, even in the storm, because the love that survives anger is the one that endures. It's the one that grows stronger. Expressing anger without hurting is an act of reconnection with yourself and with the other. It's stepping out of suspicion, emotional buildup, and silent distance. It's saying, I care so much about this relationship that I'd rather speak than pull away. It's giving the other person a chance to repair, to listen, to grow together. And it's giving yourself the right to exist in your wholeness. Because in the end, it's not about always being calm, it's about being whole. And those who allow themselves to be whole with all their colors, including the red of anger, finally stop living in fragments and begin, truly, to live in peace.